We turn now again to the crisis in British politics, which gets stranger and bizarrer by the minute. And we're joined from Edinburgh by John Wight, a journalist who has just recently published a piece on Wednesday in Consortium News to try to sort it all out. John, welcome to CN Live. Now, this last time we spoke, it was quite a mess, and you did a great job unraveling it, but it's gotten even more complex. On Tuesday, the day that Boris Johnson was in New York at the UN General Assembly and was going to address the General Assembly and had a bunch of bilateral meetings, the Supreme Court, a recently established Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, decided that he had essentially broken the law by proroguing or suspending Parliament, and that he, in essence, lied to the Queen about the reasons for doing it. And that had enormous fallout, obviously. He had to cut short his meetings in New York and fly back, and got off the plane and went to the Commons on Wednesday. What did he face, John, when he went into the Commons?
Well, Tuesday, the 24th of September 2019, was one of the most historic days in British political history, with this quite astonishing UK Supreme Court judgment ruling that Johnson had acted unlawfully in taking the action he did to prorogue the Parliament for 5 weeks with the permission of the Queen. The following day, the 25th of September 2019, is a date that will live in infamy in British political history, because he did not return from New York, where he was appearing at the UN Climate Summit and the UN General Assembly, the 74th session of the UN General Assembly. He did not return as a Prime Minister chastened by that result. He returned full of stridency and bombast and aggression, openly placing himself at the head, not of the people versus the establishment, but at the head of the mob versus the establishment. There were no apologies given. There was no contrition shown for that Supreme Court judgment. In fact, he even accused the Supreme Court of being wrong in their judgment. So the contempt for the law is now married to contempt for parliamentary sovereignty and democracy, as far as Boris Johnson is concerned. The language he used, the volcanic language of incitement, accusing his opponents of sabotage, of cowardice for failing to table a motion of no confidence and go for an early election, of trying to block the will of the people, and even of surrender to the EU. And I really do fear, and I think it's going to happen. I remember when Joe Cox was murdered, the Labour MP, the pro-EU Labour MP, he was murdered in the days leading up to the referendum in 2016 by a right-wing terrorist by the name of Thomas Mayer, who was using the same kind of language, by the way, as Boris Johnson used, the Prime Minister: surrender, traitor, sabotage, etc., etc. I do fear that someone's going to get killed. And I don't say that lightly, because the atmosphere is even more poisonous and even more toxic now, 3 years on, than it was in the lead up to that referendum. So it's a very charged atmosphere over here. I think British democracy, as I wrote in my piece for Consortium, is undergoing a mammoth stress test. Whether it will pass that test really does remain to be seen. I can't answer that either way at this juncture.
John, I remember being in the public gallery in the House of Commons after the Belgrano affair, when the Argentine ship was sunk during the Falklands War. And Michael Heseltine was leading the Tories on one side, and Eric Heffer, Eric the Red, was up there on the benches, and they were screaming fascists at the Conservatives. It was quite a thing. Have you ever seen anything, though, as contentious in Parliament as we saw on Wednesday, and what we're seeing now over this?
No, I think it's because the stakes involved are so high. This is not, the Falklands War was obviously a very serious incident, but the stakes involved in this case, and this issue rather, are so high. It's a referendum. It will determine the course of this country for generations to come. And this is what's feeding into the toxicity. It's democracy now reduced to a zero-sum game of winner take all. A 4% majority in that referendum. People arguing that should be the determining factor in where we go now. That is not an argument in favour of democracy. That's an argument, in my view, in favour of the ossification of democracy. People have changed their minds. There's buyer's remorse. A younger generation has now reached the age of being able to vote. They have to take it back to the people in some way, shape, or form. But I think now that we are reaching the level of where social cohesion has been so rent asunder that it's going to be very difficult to put it back together again. The polarisation across the UK's regions and constituent nations is of an order that I have never experienced in my lifetime. And that includes Ireland with the Irish issue and so forth. And so it seems to me that Boris Johnson has he's a rogue. The man is a complete rogue, and he's an aspiring autocrat, an aspiring right-wing autocrat. And he has many similarities in this respect with Donald Trump. And if this was normal times, Joe, his and Donald Trump's goosies would already be cooked. But these are not normal times, because the detestation of the mainstream, the liberal centre, which is more than justified after 30 odd years of Reaganomics on your side of the pond and Thatcherism this side of the pond, rising inequality, poverty, alienation, immiseration, austerity, the wars, the corruption scandals, the 1% versus the 99%, the tamping down on democracy and democratic rights, on union rights, labour rights. This has fed into this groundswell of anti-politics, and this is what fed Trump's election, and it's what's fed Brexit. But the opposition have no credibility. So when they stand in Parliament, say, we stand up for parliamentary sovereignty, people at large don't care about parliamentary sovereignty. They have a real deep detestation towards Parliament. And this is why these opportunists are able to get away with posing as they do as anti-establishment mavericks.
To what extent do you feel that this will continue to deepen and get worse in terms of the populism that's caused by these neoliberal politics, fueling the rise of these Trump and Johnson type figures? And how is it that they get away with presenting themselves as, you know, the representatives of the people when they're both part of the same neoliberal establishment that has been the cause of so much of these issues?
Well, indeed, as I said, it's because the detestation of the mainstream and the centre is of such an order that they come across with this bombastic bluster, this anti-political correctness. They're able to offer simple solutions to very simplistic problems. The simple solution in relation to austerity and the misery it's caused and the economic dislocation for them is it's migrants, it's refugees, it's them trying to come across the border, it's the other. And that's a simple target. And it taps into the most base instincts of tribalism, of national particularism, of xenophobia that reside in us all. And has only managed to be resisted if you have an alternative ideology that can counter that, which we obviously do. And that's a more nuanced ideology about understanding how the system works. For most people who don't have the time to look into the intricacies of the system, they're too busy trying to make a living and keep a roof over their head. So people are susceptible to being victims of this false consciousness that's being inculcated by these opportunists. And mass consciousness in the UK and in the US, I contend, has been shaped and forged over years, or certainly in recent years, between the anvil of this liberal centrist media that's focused on identity politics, on the lives of the rich and famous in Hollywood, and by the hammer of the alt-right with their nutty conspiracy theories and their harking back to a supposed mythical golden age when everything was pure and better. And this is a form of fascism that's abroad. I don't use that word lightly. It's overused, I know, but I really do think it's relevant now. There's similarities between now and the 1930s, and similar conditions of economic extremism and dislocation are inarguable. And I think not enough people are tapping into that history to try as a guide to where we are now. You're getting sections of the left supporting Brexit. Very, very prominent people on the left in the UK supporting Brexit. I won't name names. They've embraced this. They've gone into that swamp with this hard right reaction. And so they're mistaking the second month of pregnancy for the ninth. They think this will somehow end at a socialist conclusion. Believe me, it won't. They've taken us on the road to perdition. So that's the reason why Boris Johnson and Donald Trump have been able to successfully depict themselves and present themselves as tribunes of the benighted people, denied their rights by the Parliament and by the mainstream and by the establishment.
Yeah, and in light of what you just said, I think it seems deviously brilliant that they've been able to encourage that population to punch down, essentially.
Yes.
And in the process, from what you're saying, it sounds like they are protecting their own plutocratic class in doing so. They are totally protecting them from that mob anger.
Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah, they're deflecting from their role as part of this. I mean, this is essentially a schism within the ruling political establishment. It's a fight between the political establishment on where lies the best interest for British capital, whether it's with this multilateral, multinational trading bloc, the EU, or whether it's Britain cutting loose from that and striking all these bilateral trade deals, which is what Boris Johnson is arguing that they will be able to do. But he's harking back again. This is a very retrograde position to take, because he's harking back on empire nostalgia, Britannia rules the waves, the Union Jack, and so forth. And this is part of the series of pathologies of a diseased culture that have yet to be addressed. Britain's colonial and imperialist past, the xenophobia, nativism, the white supremacy, and this is all feeding in to this issue. And the worrying thing for me is people are actively supporting a cause that flies counter to their interests, their economic interests. The Operation Yellowhammer, the document that the government came up with, wargaming the consequences of a hard Brexit. They tried to keep it suppressed. It was leaked out. It makes chilling reading, and Jeremy Corbyn provided an exegesis of that document in his response to Boris Johnson in Parliament yesterday about chaos at the ports, about supply chains being interrupted, shortages of certain medicines and medical supplies, and most worrying of all, the fact that, according to the government's own estimation, the impact will be disproportionately felt by those on the lowest incomes. But people on lowest incomes support Brexit. They're not listening to that, because this is more about identity. It's a visceral tribal identity of what it means to be British, us and them. They have nothing in common with Boris Johnson or his class, but he's managed to persuade them that they do, because we're all part of Britain, British, and what that means, given that kind of illusory sense of feeling of superiority vis-a-vis the French, the Germans, vis-a-vis Muslims at home, vis-a-vis other minorities. It's a very pernicious and toxic time.
Very well said. And I think that it reminds me in some ways of like to put it in a US context, to not only compare it with Donald Trump. It's almost like somebody like Hillary Clinton trying to present herself as actually progressive or liberal and representative of the lower working classes. And so it's the same type of trick we've seen over and over again. Yeah. How far do you think this will go? But it seems that this is kicking a can down the road, where the more let's say a hard deal Brexit happens, that economic suffering worsens for lower classes. Do you think that will then worsen that populist rage that will then be further co-opted?
It'll deepen it because they'll be looking for someone to blame. Yeah. And people like Boris Johnson will point the finger at someone else. Again, the anger towards migrants under the auspices of free movement, mostly Eastern Europeans, that will be transferred onto existing minorities who were born in Britain, the Muslim community, the Irish are traditionally been a target. The Scots will get it because there's a rising tide of support for Scottish independence. So it's retreating back into these dangerous national tribal identities, and it's a reflex against multiculturalism. It's a similar dynamic as to what's taking place in the US. Britain is white, it's a white country, we're British, you're not British. And this is how it goes, and this is how it went in the 1930s. And look how that ended up. And never think that it can't happen here. I'm always reminded of the words of Bertolt Brecht. The womb from that which called remains fertile, when he talked about the possibility of fascism coming back. It can come back. And I think there's been a complacency setting in our institutions that we are safe, we are established democracies. Germany was one of the most advanced countries in the world in the 1930s. It was the heart of the Enlightenment. Literature, engineering, science, philosophy, and look, it happened there. It can happen again. And I really worry that it's moving in that direction. I don't think I'm indulging in hyperbole when I say that, Elizabeth. I really don't.
Elizabeth asked a great question there. Essentially, at what point will working class people, when will it explode? I mean, they keep getting duped. They believe in Johnson. They believe in Trump. They're getting screwed again. How much longer can that populist trick work before there's an explosion?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer, of course. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn has done his absolute best to straddle the line, the Remain side and the Brexit line. It's not true to say that everyone who supports Brexit is a racist. Of course not. That's a ridiculous statement to make. But it is, in my view, a regressive reactionary cause. The dominant politics driving it are reactionary. Similarly, it's not true that everyone who votes for Remain is middle class and well off. Jeremy Corbyn understands that. There's a regional breakdown to this vote. In most of the country's major conurbations like London, Manchester, Liverpool, the majority of people voted to Remain. But in the outlier region, the deindustrialised parts of the north, the Midlands, the South Wales, it was Brexit. So he's trying to, in a very noble and honourable way, trying to straddle that line and argue that, look, no matter how you voted in the EU referendum, there is more that unites you on the level of austerity, or inequality, on the lack of investment in public services, on the NHS, on jobs, on wages, and so on. And he's trying to unite people around those really common sense economic bread and butter issues. But because of this atmosphere that's been whipped up, this irrationality around the politics of identity, patriotism, nationalism, a lot of people are not listening to that. He's still behind in opinion polls, behind Boris Johnson, because what his message lacks is clarity. Nuance can sometimes get in the way of clarity. Clarity, even if it's you're selling snake oil, appeals to people in a state of heightened emotion. And that's where we are now. And Boris Johnson is deepening that emotion. He's not doing, and a wall of obfuscation has come down over the real issues affecting people's lives day to day. I think something will have to happen. There'll have to be an incident. There'll have to be an awakening moment. I hate to say it. An MP might be attacked. Worse, there may be a fatality, and the whole country will go, whoa, wait a minute, we have to stop this now. This is going too far. Something like that at this stage, I think, has to release the pressure, because the pressure is built to an intolerable level. The next stage in this process is that Boris Johnson is being given until the 19th of October to obtain an extension to the 31st October deadline from the EU. He has said that he would rather die in a ditch than do that. That's the kind of language he's employing. But if he doesn't do that, under the rubric of this Supreme Court ruling, he'll be in contempt of court. Now, I don't put it past this man. This is a man who is Foreign Secretary, Joe, called for a mass demonstration outside the Russian embassy in London over what was going on in Ukraine. I don't put it past him to try and enlist the support of the mob and get them out in the streets if it came to the point where he was going to be found to be in contempt of court and risk being arrested. I don't put it past this man to do anything at this juncture. I think, as I said, he's taken his cue from Donald Trump. He's doing his best to straddle the line of legitimacy. He's already crossed that line, and he's intent on pushing it further and further, using the will of the people. As Albert Camus said, I'll paraphrase him, that the will of the people has always been the alibi of tyrants. And this is a kind of shtick that he's employing to try and drive through this hard disaster capitalist Brexit.
Try to explain to our audience where we stand in Parliament in terms of the possibility of a no confidence vote, of him wanting to call another general election, of him actually saying in New York that he might try to prorogue Parliament again after all of this. Yeah. And what is the timeline, and why does the opposition not want a vote of no confidence? Clearly they want to get rid of him, but not now. So timing is everything. Timing is everything. Please explain if you can.
Boris Johnson's political IQ is very high. And again, I go back to this word perception. The difference, politics is perception. It's how the masses perceive what's going on in the centres of power at any given moment. And Boris Johnson is using the fact that the opposition will not proceed to table a motion of no confidence because he will lose that vote, and therefore that will trigger a general election. But as a sitting Prime Minister, he gets to set the date. I think it's within a 6 to 8 week period or whatever it is under the British Constitution. And so obviously he will set that date to after the 31st of October, thereby affecting Britain's withdrawal from the EU with no deal by default. They know that. The Parliament, the opposition know that. He knows they know that. But he can offer a simplistic, you're scared to offer an election. You won't even face your electorate. You're cowards. You're sabotaging Brexit, and you won't even give the electorate a chance to see what they think of you for doing so. So this is the problem that the opposition have. The element of perception, of clarity, is on Johnson's side in terms of his argument. But what happens now is, under the Benn Amendment, which was the Hilary Benn, son of Tony Benn, interestingly enough, that they took control of the process when Boris Johnson was refusing to listen to Parliament before he suspended Parliament. And so therefore they were saying that they demand that he must obtain an extension to the deadline by the 19th of October from the EU, who have a council meeting, I believe, not long after that. And if he doesn't do that, the Supreme Court ruling means that he will be in contempt. So we'll have to, is it now down to a case of who blinks first? If he does obtain the extension as the Parliament demands, then that's to give him space to get a deal. And then after that, then they can table a vote of no confidence, because then the pressure's off. The pressure's off the 31st of October deadline. And so this new deadline will be 3 months hence. So that's more than enough time to get rid of him via no confidence and an early election before that date.
But as we talked about last time when you were on the show, he wants this no deal Brexit because he wants an American deal. When he was in New York, before he went to the UN, he spoke at a business luncheon, and he was very explicit about the deal that he wanted with the United States. So he wants this no deal, and he would be breaking the law. They passed a law earlier this month, Commons, and the Lords approved it, and it got royal assent that if he pulled out without a deal, he would be breaking. This guy is really challenging the law here, and he's thumbing his nose at it. And he obviously thinks he can get away with it, John. Can he get away with
it? I don't know. I'm worried that he may well get away with it because he's ahead in the polls. His shtick is playing well in the country. As much as I loathe the man, I think he's a deeply malevolent, dangerous, mendacious man. He does have a personable demeanour about him. He's practised buffoonery. His Churchillian tribute act. He gets away, but scandal after scandal has dogged his political career, and he's managed to avoid losing any credibility as a consequence. He always bounces back. Now by some unbelievable set of circumstances, as Prime Minister. I remember when this guy couldn't get elected as rector of Edinburgh University. I was actually part of the campaign to get John Pilger elected. It's an honorific symbolic post. And I remember heckling Boris Johnson. This was in 2006 at the major debate. And he couldn't even get elected as rector of Edinburgh University. Now he's the Prime Minister of the country. It's just really astounding to me how he's managed to get to this position. But we know that he's desired this position with every scintilla of his being since he entered the political realm. And so now that he's there, he is determined to hold on to that position, come what may. In normal times, a Prime Minister who'd been found to have broken the law would automatically resign, as well as lying to the Queen. He would automatically resign. But yet, not even an apology. Because he believes, and he does at this juncture, he has a lot of support in the country because there's a lot of Brexit fatigue. He's the only one that's coming up with a clear plan to get out of the EU and get this thing resolved. And that's a very dangerous position to be in on a number of levels.
He certainly has a rakish charm. I mean, I watched his speech to the UN, and he had me laughing out loud. I couldn't help myself.
Yeah.
He's funny.
He's funny.
And he's a good speaker, and he has the charisma, and he's playing that to the hilt. Let's turn to Jeremy Corbyn for a minute. In the middle of all this, there was the annual Labour Party conference in Brighton. So how did Jeremy Corbyn come out of that conference and all of this? Is he weakened or is he strengthened, or is it the same?
He started the conference. There couldn't have been a worse start to the conference. There was a move by his allies on the NEC, which the party's ruling executive, to topple Tom Watson, his deputy. He's been doing his best to undermine Corbyn since Corbyn was elected. He's been fanning the flames of this fake anti-Semitism witch hunt. He's been undermining Corbyn on his Brexit position. He's just a really, really terrible guy. But the timing was catastrophic for the NEC to do this because the national media was focused on the conference. And the first day it comes out in the papers that they're trying to abolish the position of deputy leader. There's something inside the camp. There was a rumour that Corbyn may have been on the verge of announcing he was going to step down because the pressure was becoming intolerable. I mean, he's a 70-year-old man. I mean, he's been under a huge amount of pressure. And his allies worried that Tom Watson would automatically, per Labour Party constitution, take over as caretaker leader. And then that would destroy Corbynism from within. But Corbyn understood that this was a catastrophic attempt at a time when the conference was just starting to do something that looked very underhand and very sectarian. And so he came in with his own proposal that the role of deputy leader would be reviewed and they would look into the possibility of having two deputy leaders, one of which would be a woman to reflect the gender balance of the party. And so he managed to avoid that. Then it came to light that one of his key aides, who wrote the 2017 manifesto, which by all accounts was a huge success, a guy by the name of Andrew Fisher, a very intelligent guy and theorist, he'd announced that he was going to step down, and he'd written an internal memo in which he excoriated Corbyn's leadership team and said that he didn't think Corbyn could succeed. That was leaked to the Murdoch press. It appeared in the Sunday Times. So the start of the conference couldn't have been any worse. But when Corbyn's authority was challenged on his Brexit proposal, when the Remain wing of the Labour Party, supported by a couple of the affiliated trade unions, put forward a motion at conference that the Labour should embrace an explicitly Remain position. No longer would they try and straddle the line and follow the line of what's been described as constructive ambiguity. Corbyn wants a policy of we win the general election first, then we have a special conference to thrash out what our official position would be because we're going to go to the EU try and get a deal, and then put it to the people in a second referendum. That to me seems a bit convoluted in my view, but that's the position that Corbyn wants to follow. He's more of a collegiate kind of guy, and I think he doesn't have the leadership skills required for a crisis such as this. And a crisis, clarity is clear. And great guy, great policies, heart's in the right place, but I think he lacks that bite and that willingness to be ruthless as a leader. You know yourself, there's always a dynamic tension in an organisation between democracy and leadership. And I think if you make a fetish of democracy, it can actually impede your progress and you become a blunt instrument. And I worry that Labour is being perceived as that blunt instrument. But he won against this move to change the Brexit policy in the party. And there was a real sense, I think, a reunification around his leadership. And it solidified his leadership. And he got a huge standing ovation. And his speech to conference, which was brought forward because of what happened in the Supreme Court and the recall of Parliament, was very, very successful. And I thought, and everyone else thought, that the momentum from that, carrying on from the Supreme Court ruling, would come into the Parliament, and that could be the end of Boris Johnson. Lo and behold, him, with the able help of his Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, turned the tables. And I think now the momentum is back with them because of their performance in the Parliament on Wednesday, the 25th of September. As loathsome and as toxic as it was, I think that'll play well. That's played well in the country.
Given as divisive as Johnson is there any chance of a Labour-Liberal coalition somehow to join forces to win an election?
Here's the other danger. You touched on something very important, actually. There's another danger coming from the centre, that there's talk of a national government. But Corbyn would not be leading that national government. It would be someone like Ken Clarke, a soft Tory, and Harriet Harman, a Blairite Labour MP from the backbenches. She was part of Labour's cabinet. They're being put forward as being candidates to head a proposed national unity government, because unconscionably, even with this crisis at this level, there's still people in Corbyn's camp who would do anything to keep him out of power. They'd probably rather see the crisis continuing and maturing rather than see Corbyn leading up a caretaker government or coming to power on the back of it. And that's the problem that Labour has. And Corbyn was not ruthless enough, Joe, when he won a great moral victory in the 2017 general election, which May called in full confidence that she would destroy Corbyn because she was so ahead in the polls. Lo and behold, his manifesto was a game changer. It lit up the country after years of Tory austerity, and by all accounts, some experts say, and I agree with them, political commentators and psephologists say that if this election campaign had gone on another 3 weeks, he would have won, because the polls were swinging rapidly his way. But despite that, he lost her majority in Parliament, and he sidelined the Blairites and the anti-Corbyn faction in the PLP. But he should have demanded at that juncture, with that moral strength that he gained from that result and his performance, that there was mandatory reselections of all their seats to get rid of this Blairite rump. But this is a congenital failure of the left. As soon as you get a victory, is reach out to your enemy and say, let's unite, because we're not used to winning. So we try and be magnanimous. Let's lead to, and this is what he did, and he made a big mistake, because they just played a waiting game. They were saying, oh no, let's unite. And since then, it's been death by 1,000 cuts. These anti-Semitism this, anti-Semitism that, sitting down with terrorists, sitting down with Hamas, and it's never stopped. And so there's an old saying, John, in a UK Parliament, your opponents are sitting ahead of you and your enemies are sitting behind you. And Corbyn's got a huge array of enemies still sitting behind him, and he should have dealt with them, because I think that this juncture, if he had, he would have been in a far stronger position to succeed as leader of the Labour Party.
I hate to risk speaking too broadly, but in the same way that we've compared Johnson and Trump, I think you really can compare Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, and the way in which the left attacks Bernie Sanders as well, especially the neoliberal kind of quadrants of the left in the US. But stepping aside from that for a moment and returning to Boris Johnson, I was wondering if you could just very briefly and in a general sense give our US audience some idea of Johnson's political history, how he got to where he is, his general pedigree, I guess you could say, is in terms of his political career.
Well, Boris Johnson started his political life as a journalist, and he was sacked from about 2 or 3 publications. One for fabricating a story, fabricating quotes. I mean, he's a roguish figure. He was a high-profile columnist with the Times, I believe, Then he went to the Telegraph. Then he was the editor of the Spectator magazine, which is a right-wing publication. And then he got into politics. He ran for Mayor of London. Well, he started off trying to run for Rector of Edinburgh University, didn't get that. But he won the mayoralty of London from Ken Livingstone. And he served 2 terms there. He left a mess behind, and then he got into Parliament in a safe Tory seat. And that's how he's proceeded from there. So he doesn't have a huge backstory, but he has a massive backstory in terms of public life. He's always been on these celebrity political shows as a talking head, as a guest on various reality shows, and so he's always had a large presence. Boris Johnson. He comes with that sense of entitlement and that confidence that's bred at Eton, and then he's, as I say, managed to enter Parliament with a safe seat a number of years ago, and now he's been catapulted to the office, made Foreign Secretary. Now he's catapulted to the office of Prime Minister. He's a very popular guy amongst Tory grassroots because he doesn't play the game of political correctness. He's come out with racist statements, misogynistic statements, but he does it in a way that make people laugh. You know, he went to Libya in his capacity as Foreign Secretary to CERT, and he was talking about reinvesting in Libya after the disaster that befell the country after 2011. And he said CERT could be a massive tourist attraction. All we have to do is clear away the dead bodies. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric the guy uses. And, you know, it's disgusting on a certain level, but the man in the street would enjoy that. You know, they would find that funny. And his delivery is good, and he's got this buffoonish, cartoonish demeanour about him, which I think is very, very cleverly employed to deflect from the malevolence that really runs through his veins.
Well, it's even more that he shares in common with Trump in that sense, the reality TV and the cartoonish kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, Joe. Absolutely. Yeah, he's all form and no content.
And isn't it interesting how on the same day the Supreme Court said that he'd broken the law, that Trump started, there would be impeachment proceedings against him. Same day. And they're both in New York meeting at the UN. That was a day that's going to go down, as you said at the beginning of this interview. Probably, certainly in history, but if not in infamy. John Wight, I want to thank you for joining us from Edinburgh again to bring us up to speed on this extremely fascinating political crisis in the United Kingdom. And John, I hope you join us again in the future on CN Live.